On the upside, we hit the bullseye. We said inflation would go to 9%. It went to 9.1. Coming down, it's coming down and will be in our zone by the end of this year, 2.5 to 3%. And I think it will keep falling as we go into 2025. I also think, in addition to inflation continuing to come down in the United States, that we'll enter a recession sometime, probably late this year, early next year.
Steve Hanke, professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins University and founder and co-director of the Institute for Applied Economics, Global Health, and the Study of Business Enterprise. It is so great to welcome you back to the show, Professor Hanke. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Great to be with you again, Julia.
Well, I'm excited to have you back. It's been just over a year since we last had you. Our audience loves hearing from you. I always get requests for you. And so I'm just thrilled to have you back on the show, Professor Hanke. And I'd like to start where I always start with my guest, and that is to get the big picture, more of that macro view, where we are today, the framework in which you're looking at the world. We can look globally and domestically. And one of the things about this show, Professor Hanke, is you can take all the time you need to set the table when it comes to that big picture macro view.
Okay, Julia, let's start with the U.S. I think the most reliable way to look at the macroeconomic picture is to use monetary economics, or what's called the quantity theory of money. In other words, the changes in the money supply, or the stock of the money supply, make the economy go around or not go around. So what we've had, to put it into perspective, is kind of a big roller coaster in the United States. We had COVID, remember, way back in 2020, February of 2020, the money supply shot up. And with a lag, of course, we got inflation. And then the Federal Reserve, the central bank, put things in reverse and started squeezing the money supply down, actually contracting it. The stock of money in the economy is lower today than it was in July of 2022. So the roller coaster, you go up, the money supply pumps up things, asset prices go up, the economy revs up, and you ultimately get inflation. Then they put the brakes on and start contracting, and you go down the roller coaster. Now, this has happened, by the way, typically in the United States. It happened in the United Kingdom, and it happened in the Eurozone. So the roller coaster was going big time in those three big places. Now, a lot of people say, well, this is all a global thing. It's not global. The roller coaster is always local because you have local central banks. It happened that the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and the European Central Bank all did the same thing. So the roller coaster did the same thing. But in China, by some measures, the biggest economy in the world, China didn't. Japan, another big economy, it didn't. And also we had Switzerland, not such a big country, but it didn't. So the roller coaster, there was a little roller coaster, but a little tiny. It kind of went up a little bit in China and then down. And actually inflation in China now is almost zero. I mean, there's almost no inflation in China. And there's been very low inflation in Japan for almost 30 years. And the reason for that is that the money supply is growing at a very slow rate. So that's the picture generally. Keep the roller coaster in mind. In some countries, it's been a wild ride because the money supply has been changing in a wild way, first up and then down. But some places, the roller coaster, it's almost nothing happening. Japan, China, Switzerland, even places like Indonesia and India, it's been a kind of a mild ride. So that's the picture. Now, where are we in the United States? Well, we're in this contraction phase where inflation is coming down. It's came in at 3% just a week ago. That surprised everybody, but not me, because John Greenwood and I predict, using the quantity theory of money, that by the end of the year, it'll be about 2.5% to 3%. Well, it's already 3%. So it looks like we'll hit the bullseye again. On the upside, we hit the bullseye. We said inflation would go to 9%. It went to 9.1. So we got pretty close on that one. Coming down, it's coming down, and we'll be in our zone by the end of this year, 2.5% to 3%. And I think it will keep falling as we go into 2025. So that's the broad picture. And I also think, in addition to inflation continuing to come down in the United States, that we'll enter a recession sometime, probably late this year, early next year.
Yeah, this is such a great metaphor. I love the roller coaster. So are we about to drop on the roller coaster? Where are we? Sounds like recession impending.
We're going on the downside. When the roller coaster, think of it in, there are various ways to think of it, but I'm talking about it now in terms of inflation, Julia. So inflation, it went way up to the peak, and now it's been coming down. It had 3 or 4 months in there where it didn't move very much, and then the last reading we got, it tipped down to 3%. I think it'll continue to go down, and as I say, we'll be in that 2.5%, 3% zone by the end of this year. So that's the inflation side. The economy side, if you look at that, I think things are slowing down, and they will probably slow us into recession late this year, early next year.
Mm-hmm. On the inflation side, you're right. You did nail that call. 9.1% is what we saw top out at, the 9%. And then on the downside as well. And I remember you talking about that the last time you were on this show. And looking at the quantity theory of money. So my question for you, Professor Hanke, and maybe we can put on the professor lens, if you will. If you had to grade or assess the Federal Reserve and their response, their efforts to bring inflation down, I would just be curious to put that to you. Just what's your assessment of the Federal Reserve, their policy the last couple of years?
I think that over this whole roller coaster ride, it's an F. It's one of the worst performances of the Federal Reserve. Of course, not as bad as the Great Depression, 1929 to 1933. They really messed things up. But it's very bad, and I would say an F grade for 2 reasons. Number one, they're not looking at the money supply. They don't pay any attention to the money supply. And in fact, Chairman Powell has actually trashed the money supply idea. He claims there's really no relationship that's reliable between changes in the stock of money and changes in economic activity and changes in inflation. Well, that's just rubbish. I mean, the average guy you meet on a street corner knows that if they goose the money supply, you're going to get inflation. And if they contract it, we've had 4 contractions in the history of the Fed since 1913. And every one of those has led to a deflating economy and ultimately a recession. Of course, the big one is 1929, 1933. There was a huge contraction of the money supply. We got a Great Depression. But Greenwood and I have been looking at this very carefully, and we looked at a number of countries, and the amazing thing is that the roller coaster, the magnitude of how high you go up is determined by how much the change in the money supply or the stock of money is. So as I say, some places went up a lot higher than others, the United States, United Kingdom, and the Eurozone. And some didn't go up hardly at all. That would be Japan, China, and Switzerland, for example. And India would fall into that category. But the interesting thing is this rubbish that there's no relationship between changes in the money supply and inflation. Greenland and I looked at a number of countries and have just finished this work, actually. And the lag between the peak growth rate in the money supply and the peak in inflation is almost the same in all countries. It took 19 months for the change to occur in the United States. You peak out the money supply, and 19 months later, inflation, that 9.1% thing comes in. UK, 23-month lag. Eurozone, 22-month lag. Canada, 23-month lag. Australia, 24-month lag. New Zealand, 21-month lag. Switzerland, 22. China, 24. India, 22. And I could go on and on. It's all the same. The lags have been almost the same. So the time that it takes for the money supply change to peak out and then get transmitted through the economy into the peak inflation is more or less the same every place. It's been about 20 months this time around. The only difference is and the lag. Why is this so important? This is where people get messed up, because they forget what's happening today is the result of something that happened to the money supply 20 months ago. So no one remembered. Number one, most people aren't at the Fed. They're not even looking at the money supply. But if you are looking at the money supply and think it's important, most people forget what was happening 20 months ago. So they're all confused. They look at daily data that are coming out. They're what's called data dependent. The Fed is data dependent. They look at the data coming out on interest rates, the stock market, all the interest rate spreads, and all these other data sensitive things that are the result of changes that happened in the money supply a long time ago. So they're looking at the symptoms, not the cause. The cause is always the money supply.
For the lay person out there, can you just explain how the money supply works, how you see it expand, how you see it contract? What is the mechanism that kind of drives that?
Well, there are two things that produce money. One is the Federal Reserve itself, the central bank. And for example, if the Federal Reserve buys government bonds from the non-bank public, if they buy bonds from you, Julia, what happens? Well, you sell it, you send them the bond, or electronically it's transmitted to them, and it goes on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, and they credit your checking account. And checking accounts are counted as part of the money supply. So the money supply goes up. And if they're selling bonds, just the reverse happens. They send you a bond and you send them a check, and your checking account goes down and the money supply goes up. So that's the Fed part of it. Now that's fairly small, actually. That's only around 17% of the money supply. The big elephant in the room are commercial banks. So if you go to your bank and you take out a loan, what happens? Or you get a mortgage, you go to a mortgage bank and get a mortgage. Well, what happens? You incur a liability, but they top up your checking account. And when they top up your checking account, that increases the money supply. So about 75%, 75 or 80% right now of the money supply measured by M2 is actually accounted for by liquid deposits like checking accounts at banks. So in a way, people don't understand this, that the money supply is actually primarily created privately by private banks. the Fed, the central bank, does play an important role because it sets the rules of the game, and it engages in active monetary policy that can, the size of the balance sheet of the Fed can change. And when that changes, of course, that does change the money supply, as I just went through. But the big elephant in the room are the commercial banks. And right now, their bank credit's not increasing very much at all. And as I said, the Fed's contribution on a year-over-year basis is less than 1%. It's 0.6%, the growth rate. Now, if the money supply was growing at an appropriate rate, what I call Hanke's golden growth rate, that would be about 6%. The overall money supply, M2, should be growing at about 6%, and that would be consistent with the Fed being able to hit its inflation target at 2%. But as you can see, it's growing a lot less than that, and that's why inflation's coming down. And if things continue, actually will go down below the 2% target.
What would that mean? Like, what would that mean if you had inflation below the 2% target? What are the implications there?
Well, the big implication is that interest rates follow inflation rates, so interest rates would come down pretty hard. If you look at the 10-year yield on the 10-year bond, which is the most important long-term bond in the United States, the yield is just a tad over 4%. It would come down quite a bit below that, and mortgage rates would come down, and rates on credit card debt would come down. So that's the big. As the disinflation comes in and the consumer price index goes down, with a lag, you'll see interest rates coming down. Yields on bonds will come down.
Got it. You know, one of the things I am keen to discuss with you is our fiscal picture here in the U.S. Just looking at the U.S. national debt clock, we're now 34.9 trillion, ticking higher. Professor Hanke, what do you make of our debt situation, our growing deficits? I would just love to hear more of your big picture thoughts.
Well, number one, the deficit, in a way, if let's say there's no deficit, let's say if the budget is balanced, what that implies is that the government's spending money, and the price of that is equal to the cost. The cost is what the government's spending, and the revenue they're receiving is the price. So you have a shall we say, a fair price in a way. If you're running a deficit, you have a lying price because the government's spending money, and they're not pricing you for the full cost of what they're spending. So they're lying to you. They give you the impression that, oh, we can spend a dollar, but we're only charging you 95 cents. And so you get this kind of fiscal illusion going on. People get fooled. But the problem is with the deficit, ultimately somebody pays the price. And who pays the price? Well, it could be, it's out in the future. It could be somebody who's not even born today is going to have to pay for this, because you have to pay interest on the debt, and the debt has to be amortized. So somebody pays it. And the interest cost right now is a big problem, because it's becoming a bigger and bigger chunk of the federal budget. It actually, the interest expenditures now are actually exceed the budget for the Defense Department. Mm-hmm. So it's a huge cost that's going in to the budget. So to correct this, we've had various statutory changes over the years. Remember Graham-Rudman, for example, that was a statutory change that was designed to limit and control a deficit and government spending. it worked for a short period of time, but the politicians always figure out some way around it, and it eventually collapsed, like all these statutory changes. So the only thing that you can do to really fix the deficit problem, and it must eventually be fixed because it's not sustainable right now. Even the Congressional Budget Office, a nonpartisan technocratic outfit that's part of the government, is indicated it's not sustainable. It can't go on. And as Herb Stein, the chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors under Richard Nixon, had a quip. He said, if something can't go on, it will stop. So the question is, well, how is it going to stop? Now, with the current institutional setup, there are only three ways that it can stop. One is you pull in your horns and stop spending so much money. That's one way. The other two ways involve taxes. One is increasing direct taxes that you pay to the IRS, and the other is an indirect inflation tax. So we have two tax ways and government spending. I think the best way is to change the institutional setup and have a constitutional amendment that would do something like they did in Switzerland. In Switzerland, they changed the constitution a few years ago, and they put in what they call a Swiss debt brake. And the Swiss debt brake basically says that government spending in Switzerland can't go up any more rapidly than the growth rate in the economy. So the relative size of the government can't expand. It can't crowd out the private sector. And the other thing is that at least over the intermediate term, not every year, but over a few years, the budget must be balanced. So that means you'd have to go to Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, have a constitutional convention to change the U.S. Constitution. So that's the thing I think we should do, and that's the only thing that will ultimately solve the problem, because these statutory fixes and Band-Aids that they put on the thing, they just aren't sustainable. They just don't work, because the politicians always figure a way to tear the Band-Aid off.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, like, what would be the likelihood of that, like a constitutional amendment, or would we just get to the point where we're forced to make that decision? Because I'd imagine, like, it's probably hard for politicians to get elected on this.
I'm working with a group now that I'm optimistic that we'll get the number of states required to have a convention and debate and vote on the issue.
That would be great.
I'm an optimist when I'm not saying it's in the bag with 100%, but it's a real possibility. Article 5 was put in the Constitution by the framers that gave the possibility for amendments to the Constitution, and I think if we have the right number of states, we can have a convention and we can debate the issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, have a conversation and debate it. What happens, Professor Hanke, if we don't do anything? What is the path that we're on right now? Sounds like it's definitely not sustainable. What would be the end game if we don't act or do something?
Well, I think the end game is Herb Stein's end game. It will stop. It's not going to go on it isn't sustainable. It won't go on. So they're either going to increase taxes, have more inflation, or cut government spending, or some combination of the three. Those are the only possibilities, unless you have a constitutional amendment change. Now that basically would force you to do two things: control government spending and balance the budget.
Going back to the fiscal spending, I wrote this down. You talked about a fiscal illusion. How much does that kind of impact the economy, the fiscal spending side of things? And it might seem like a rosier picture, but maybe it's not, or not so sustainable.
Well, there's always The problem with that, there's if you have a lying price. Now, if the price is lying to you, think about going into a store. What if you think, it's like a sale? You're motivated to go in and buy. If you think something's on, if you want something, you've wanted it for a long time, all of a sudden it goes on sale. Bang, you go in and buy it. Even if you don't want it, you might be attracted and say, "Oh, gee, I'm going to pick that thing up. It's a good deal." So that tricks everybody right away. So that's one problem. The other problem is something you don't see, and that is to collect taxes. The government spends $1, but to collect taxes damages the economy because you're distorting something in the private sector. You're taxing people, and that distorts things in the economy. And it also costs money to administer the tax system. You can't tax people at no cost. It costs money to administer the IRS and the whole tax system. So if you look at the what they call the deadweight loss, for every dollar that's collected, the cost is between about $2 and $2.50. So there's no such thing as a free lunch. The government spending that you think you might be getting a good deal on because of the lying price is really a bad deal, because it's costing $2 or maybe up to $2.50 to actually collect the taxes, because the economy is damaged by taxing, and it costs you to administer the system and collect the taxes. So that's something you don't see. And that's very important. Most people don't even think about it. They think collecting taxes is just a frictionless, no-cost deal. If the government collects $1 of taxes, they think the cost is $1. No, it's $2 to $2.50. So running the government is a lot more expensive than people think. It's not the amount of money that they're spending. You have to count the deadweight cost. Now, the only people doing that, you get a few people in public finance, a few experts in public finance that do it. But even the broad array of courses, if you look at the textbooks in public finance at universities, there are only a few that even covered deadweight loss. It's a big deal, and it's not even covered in the basic textbooks. So no, even the experts, so-called experts, don't even pay attention to it.
Well, I have to say, Professor Hanke, it has been an absolute honor having you back on the show. I love just listening to you and learning from you, and I know the audience appreciates it as well. So I just want to say thank you again, and be well. And I look forward to our next conversation.
I do too. Let's not wait a year before we do it again.
I agree. We'll do it more often.
Okay,
maybe in
great.
maybe 3 months, I'll reach back out and just get an update.
Quarterly is not bad.
Okay, perfect. Our audience would love that, and I would too. So I would love to set up something quarterly. That would be amazing.
That'll be great. Have a good day.
You too. Take care, Professor Hanke.
It's going to be 100 degrees Fahrenheit in Baltimore today.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina, and so I got my exercise in really early this morning, but it's going to be hot as well.
Yeah, good for you. I'll go to the pool later on.
There you go. Well, stay cool. Take care, Professor Hanke. I appreciate you.
Thank you.